Welcome. My name is Gumani Chimomora. I'm the senior EFF researcher. Welcome to the EFF Book Club on a Saturday, those who are in Gauteng, on a rainy Saturday. This is an EFF initiative during the 21 days lockdown that was announced by government to try and stop the spread of coronavirus. So we're all supposed to be at home, no unnecessary movement. So the book club, the way it's structured is that we've picked up 7 key readings. The 7 key readings, to date we've done 2 key readings. This is the 3rd reading. The first reading was the founding manifesto of the EFF. It was done by the Deputy President, Komisa Fuletshiwambu. The second reading was done by Dr. Komisa Mboisenindlozi. Now today we're doing the 3rd reading, The State and the Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. And I am going to be taking you through that conversation. And hopefully in the last 3 days, everyone has read the reading. Now, how I'm going to structure the talk is that, firstly, we're going to look at Lenin as a person, but also as a political figure in relation to socialist revolution all over the world, to what significance he has added. And then we're going to look briefly on the 1917 socialist revolution of Russia, also known as the October Revolution. And with that context and the background, and then we're going to go and look at the text for today, which is The State and the Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. And the idea behind the book club is that we take these key readings and put them together in such a way that after having read all of it, we discuss it in a much simpler and accessible way so that we're all able to understand, at least have some basic grounding to the literature, so that going forward, when we talk about Marx, Lenin, and later on when we do reading on Fanon, people have an understanding, and we should remove all the barriers around literature. So how I'm going to structure it is that, and then we'll deal with few questions that were, there are many questions that were sent. It's just that we're limited in terms of time. We don't have the whole day, and otherwise we'll go through all the questions. We'll do 4 questions that we thought maybe might be more relevant to the reading. And let's read so that when we send our questions, they're much more relevant to the readings for each section of the book club. So this is the book club, EFF, hashtag EFF book club, and we're going to start now. So I will have about just under an hour or so to cover all those things. So let's start. Who was Vladimir Lenin? Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Ilyich was his other name. His parents gave him that name, and we'll talk about how the name Lenin comes in later on. So Lenin is born in 1870. 1870, most historians all over the world, we sort of agree that 1870 was the beginning of the second industrial revolution, after the first industrial revolution in the early 1800s, or mid 1800s, so to speak. Now, the second industrial revolution happened, so massive expansion of use of electricity, standardization of manufacturing at a big scale, and also expansion of infrastructure for production. And Lenin is born in that period. And he's a gifted, radical intellectual of the 20th century, with no doubt, amongst the best. He is born in a town called Simbrik in Russia. They've changed the name now to something else. I tried pronouncing it earlier on. It's a little bit tricky. So Lenin is born in that area. He's born in Russia. He's a gifted radical intellectual. And he has a long history of being invested in revolution. Because this is not a biography of Lenin, I'm not going to go into details. But safe to say that even when he was young, things were obvious that, number one, he's someone who was radical in his character, but also he was not lazy. He was invested in scholarship. Lenin was able to sit, read, and write, and engage in thinking throughout his youthhood, and eventually when he became a much bigger political figure in Russia and all over the world. Now, if you want to read more about Lenin, one of the readings I would suggest you look at is Robert Service. Robert Service writes Lenin, A Political Life, Volume 1. Even though, you are writing about a very gigantic political figure, possibly one of the greatest single force in socialist revolution in the 1900s. So it's not going to be easy to write. You have to balance it properly. But that reading, it's highly recommended. So we're not going to go into details about, but what was Lenin's contribution to the socialist revolution. Now, we use the word socialist revolution today. So Lenin lived in the late 1800, early 1900. So some of these words with languages, they've evolved over time. We're talking about socialist revolution. Socialist revolution in today's terms, it will be workers-led revolution essentially, although we still use the word. Lenin's contribution to the socialist revolution is that throughout the world, if you look from the 1900s, he writes something, he writes a text called What is to be Done. He writes that in 1901, but eventually it gets published in 1902. And in that text, Lenin does three things brilliantly. So number one, what he does is that he defined Marxism, what he considered to be genuine Marxism. And at that time when he was writing it in 1901, he says that there are emerging tendencies within then the Socialist Revolution Labour Party of Russia, which he was a member of. These tendencies that are emerging, he termed them opportunistic tendencies and characterized them around what he called tailism and economism. And he argued that they will reduce the Revolutionary Party into what he called trade unionism, because the argument being pushed by conservative Marxists at the time was that, number one, as revolutionaries, you ought to stand at the back and allow workers on their own to lead the struggle. That's the argument they made. And Lenin says, no, you can't. So you can't allow the spontaneity of workers on their own without class consciousness to lead the revolutionary struggle, because you will reduce that to issues of wage and working conditions. And this is evidenced by what most trade unions are characterized from the early 1900s. So that's number one. But also, number two, which is what has shaped most socialist revolutionaries, including socialist revolutionary parties, is that Lenin gives this understanding to say you cannot lead a revolution without a theory, without scientific studying of material condition to get a grounding and understanding of what is happening with class struggle in general. So, Commissar Dr. Mboiseni last reading, he did frequently asked questions on Marxism, and he talked about class struggle. For you to understand class struggle and constant changes that happen in society, you ought to base the revolution on theory. You have to study it scientifically. Otherwise, what will happen is that you will make up things as you go, and that is not really beneficial. Otherwise, you'll end up having what Lenin later on in the book referred to as utopian ideas or dreamland. When we arrive at a socialist or communist society, it will be like this, but it turned out not to be, because it didn't ground the revolution on theory. So Lenin argued that strongly, and it's one of the greatest contributions that has shaped many socialist revolutions. But he also does something else in the early 1900s. He gives a far much practical guidance in terms of how to create a revolutionary party. And he argued at that time for what he called professional revolutionaries. Of course, today, if you use the word professional revolutionaries, it will mean something completely different. But at the time, what he was referring to was you are a full-time party worker who work in the party, educate, experience, and teach full-time without having to do other things. And then you go to the workers who are going to work on a daily basis in their factories, wherever they work, and then you inject class consciousness so that they don't see their struggles as only limited to issues of their working condition and their relationship with the work area and the capitalist system. So they're able to see themselves outside the working space, but having a much broader role to play in a workers-led struggle in society. So he does that. And he talked about, you will find words like militancy, radicalism, but you'll also find words like discipline. You'll find words like being a full-time organizer and what it means. So that is Lenin's contribution to socialist and revolution. And those who have encountered Lenin's text in their reading, although it was not in the reading that we're doing now, they will be familiar with a very famous phrase of saying that without a revolutionary theory, there cannot be a revolutionary movement. That is essentially what Lenin meant, and that is one of his biggest contributions in shaping revolutionary movements all the time. And if you look at the facts, purely the facts, you'll find it to be very true. So, having looked at the socialist revolutionaries and his contribution, what was the significance of the socialist revolution of 1917 of Russia, also known as the October Revolution? Now, there are a number of elements to it because we have the benefit of history, having looked at literature broadly. One of the key benefits to that, or the significance of that revolution, is that a socialist-led Marxist radical party is able to channel society struggles and dissent workers' dissent in factories, that a socialist-led Marxist radical party is able to channel society struggles and dissent, workers' dissent in factories and everywhere else, to lead a proper revolution, to be able to take power from a capitalist state or a capitalist quasi-monarch state, provisional government. We'll come to it later on. But the key thing is that Lenin is able to organize his comrades in the Bolshevik party. They take over power and then demonstrate that it is possible to organize society in a different way. But more importantly and more substantially, Lenin writes in 1901 that you cannot allow spontaneity to happen in a revolution. You must lead it from the front. And this is what you see with the October Revolution. The Bolshevik lead from the front and organize society that otherwise would not have achieved the revolution if they were not organized and with proper leadership. So that is the significance of it. And he was vindicated in a way, because if you look at the commentary around the October Revolution, those who wrote most about it will tell you, and it's not an exaggeration, they say that with even those who were involved in the struggle, by the way, the likes of Trotsky, they write that without Lenin, the October Revolution would not have happened. But over and above that, you have a Marxist radical party that takes over state power, and not only do they take state power, they go on to be a socialist party in a state, in a sense that they then started doing what they said they would do before they took over power. For example, they started nationalizing land. They took over strategic sectors, industries in Russia at the time, and then they move on to expand services in terms of literacy, education, and everything else. And also the key thing and the significant thing about the socialist revolution of 1917 and how it became very influential is that these comrades led by Lenin, they take over power, but unlike what happened in 1871 in what is called Paris Commune, they are able to defend the gains of the revolution through the Red Army. In other words, you are not simply going to take over power from the capitalist state or capitalism in general and there's no retaliation. So there is a retaliation, but because they were much more prepared and there was a scientific understanding of how to lead the struggle, and being led by people like Lenin, who are students of Marx, then they were able to defend the gains of revolution. That is why other revolutions that followed afterwards, people were much more confident in saying that we take over power, number one, but then we defend the revolution. And that's why it becomes very significant, a practical application of Marxism led by Lenin. And like I said earlier on, it's not an exaggeration to say that without Lenin there would not have been the Russian Revolution. So those are just two aspects, just to show the significance, number one, of Lenin on socialist revolution all over the world since 1900 up to today, and how we organize today. But secondly, to show the significance of 1917 revolution. So the Paris Commune I spoke about earlier. So in 1971, there's war in Paris. France is fighting Germany. Paris at that time is one of the key commune. They used to call them commune by their communities around a country. So the workers, for the first time, they take over power in 1971, and then when they take over power, it didn't last long. They started organizing society the way they imagined it, with workers in power and rearranging society. But they didn't defend the gains of that revolution. But it's still significant in many ways because there are key lessons there, and I'll talk to it later on when I come to a point about Marx and Engels. So within 3 months or so, then the power went back to the capitalist state. So that is the significance of 1917 revolution. Now, those who want to understand more the influence and the impact of Lenin, some of the readings that I would recommend strongly. For example, I mentioned earlier on, What is to be Done, published in 1901. But the other key text that I would recommend of Lenin is Imperialism, the Highest Form of Capitalism. So he wrote this during the World War I in 1916. And he's writing this while he was still in Switzerland, and I'll explain to it, I'll talk to it later on why he was in Switzerland. So he wrote in 1916, Imperialism, the Highest Form of Capitalism. And what he does with the text, if you get an opportunity to look at it, you'll realize that it has a lot of economic data and graphs. And it's written with a serious, detailed analysis of some, even including bourgeois economists, to be able to explain global finance and monopoly capital and how it moved around the world at that time. And one of the key arguments he made in the book is that warfare, what we now call military industry complex, was actually a movement within capitalism, because one of the key arguments was that if capitalism did not expand into other territories through colonization, what would have happened eventually is that it was going to, from within, it was going to self-destruct. And Lenin calls the expansion and colonization an escape route for capitalism to expand its existence and its ability to revolve. So that is imperialism, the highest form of capitalism. You can go and read it, but also Lenin wrote a lot. I mean, and when they were writing why it becomes a lot, it's because the style of writing was different. So in the 1916 and 1917, there was a lot of competition around trying to get the buy-in of the workers. So most people were trying to put their ideologies forward in a much simpler way to understand, so that they'll be able to win the voice and the votes of the workers and even the peasant. So they were not writing books per se. So what they were writing were pamphlets. Even the book that we're going to look at much later is a pamphlet. So it might, those who don't read a lot might look like it's long, but it's really not that long. It's a pamphlet. They were writing pamphlets a lot, and Lenin was one of those people who wrote a lot, these pamphlets. So you can go and look at a website called www.marxist.org. You will find a lot of literature there under Lenin. So there's things like the April thesis is there. Even when after the revolution you continue writing. So those are some of Lenin key texts. Now let's come to the reading. The reading that we're looking at, State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. Now, to understand the text, and I'll try to speak in a much more accessible English. To understand the text, one has to understand, number one, the context I gave much earlier, but you need to understand where at that time Russia was. So the book is written in 1917, but like it has been said before, with most revolutions, they don't happen with single event. So revolution happened over time. So if you look at the French Revolution of 1840s, if you look at the Paris Commune of 1871, and even the Russian Revolution, the 1905, which I'll talk to in a second, you will find that it's accumulation, like they make up. There are a lot of events which when you add them up much later on, then they become this revolution, and whatever eventuality it becomes. So you have to understand the background, but also it's difficult to understand the book that we're looking at, State and Revolution, without understanding a proper material condition under which Lenin wrote the book. So before we look at the book, let's just speak briefly about how the book was put together. And then we'll be able to understand some of the things like style of writing and even the language. So Lenin, there was a revolution in Russia in 1905. So this revolution in Russia in 1905 happens. At that time, Russia was under a monarch. A monarch is when you don't have a government with the way we understand it. You don't have the state the way we understand it. You are ruled by those people who have a right of birth of right to rule you over. So the emperor in Russia in 1905 it was Nicholas II. So Nicholas II comes from a 400 years heritage other emperors. So he was at that time the emperor responsible for governing Russia. So there's a revolution in 1905. It led to an arrangement of quasi-monarch and liberal democracy in that sense. So there's a parliament, they refer to it as Duma in Russia. So that parliament works with the monarch, Nicholas, and then they make laws. But he still had a lot of power as an emperor. He can overrule decisions of parliament, so to speak, the Duma. And then what happens is that the comrades in the Bolshevik, because they were involved in the revolution, so some of them left Russia. So Lenin was one of those people who left Russia, and then he went to Switzerland. So he spent some time in Switzerland, almost about 10 years in Switzerland, also having been to other European states, but he was not in Russia. Still being member of the Bolshevik, it was not the Bolshevik at the time. No, it was the Bolshevik because it split in 1903. So he left to go to Switzerland. In Switzerland, he writes a lot. He writes this pamphlet and articles. And when he was writing, so he tries to write under different names. And historians say that he was writing under different names to show that he's not the only one who shares these views, particularly those radical revolutionary views. So he would put alias names. And Lenin is one of those names. It was not his birth name. So today we know him as Vladimir Lenin. It came through that process and it stuck since then, and we've called him Lenin. So you then find that things happen from 1905. There's a bourgeois liberal Duma parliament, and Nicholas is still there. And then what happened is that in 1917, so Lenin wrote in 1916, Imperialism, the highest form of capitalism, is able to explain some geopolitical shifts that were happening. And one of the things that he explained is that Russia was not as developed as its counterparts in Europe. So he was looking at England, UK, he was looking at Germany and France. France, politically, it was much more developed. And then he made an argument to say, because Russia is still exporting a lot of timber, and it was not processed timber, so it was not as developed as the case. In 1917, in the middle of the war, World War I, Russia is not doing very well. It's going through difficulties. And then what happened is that there's a sort of like, you can call it a revolution in a way, because it's women who went to the street to protest shortage of food during this World War I, and Russia is losing. And this is happening at the capital city at that time of Russia, which was called Petrograd. And it was renamed from St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was one of the former emperors. So it was renamed to Petrograd. There's this serious protest by women who later on get joined by workers also. But even some members of these revolutionary parties, at that time they were split between Menshevik and Bolshevik, meaning that the Menshevik were the minority in the 1903 conference and the Bolshevik were majority. Now, in this so-called, let's call it revolution, so to speak, there's a monumental shift that happens. So Nicholas III loses power. In other words, they lose the reign after 400 of monarch. There is no longer the quasi-monarch bourgeois parliament, Duma, that was there. He's advised to relinquish power, and then there was a provisional government in Russia in 1917. So this happened in February. So there's a provisional government in Russia, and then the provisional government is made up of liberals, really. But also the additional element to it was that Petrograd Soviet, which is workers that were selected from different constituencies, they also form part of that arrangement. But it was a provisional government with an understanding that much later on, Russia is going to go and have elections. So Lenin is in Switzerland, and he gets very agitated by developments, and it's scientifically constantly studying changes that are happening. And being Lenin and the Bolshevik and being radical, so he takes a trip in April from Switzerland, and there's a history around why he didn't go straight to Russia. So he goes from Switzerland, he goes to Germany, and there's some controversies around it. and then he goes to Sweden and Finland, and then eventually he ends up in Petrograd, the capital city of Russia at the time. And when he arrives there, in his true style, Lenin, there was a welcoming committee organized, led by Trotsky. Trotsky is one of the key figures in the Russian Revolution, and Marxism is a Marxist also. So there's a welcoming committee. They've arranged everything. He arrives there. Most of you would have seen a picture where Lenin is coming out of a train, taking off his cap. So you find that he arrives, and when he arrives, the first thing he does is to address the crowd spontaneously. He addressed the crowd after not being in Russia for a very long time. He addressed the crowd and he says some key things that were very monumental. This is in April. One of the key things he says is that there must be peace. This war that Russia is involved in with its allies is not about the workers. We are just sending our working men to die at the trenches. This is the war between bankers and profits. So that's one of the things that Lenin mentioned. The second thing that he mentioned is that there's a famous slogan which most people know, peace, land, and bread. He declared that this bourgeois provisional arrangement, government that is there, is not going to lead to workers' revolution. Because Marx, Engels, and Lenin truly believed that you are not going to achieve socialism through parliament and votes and this bourgeois democracy, liberal democracy. They were very firm about it. And Engels was one of those who argued through and through until his death to say, you need to have a proper socialist revolution, workers-led revolution. And how you see this is that Lenin criticized that arrangement that was there, and in a very antagonistic way to the government at the time, the provisional government, and it was led by some of his former comrades. If you have read the book that we're going to talk about, you'll find a figure, Kaczynski is one of those figures. So this is Lenin, not having been in Russia for such a long time. He comes back, the first thing he does, he started. But because he had scientifically studied how parties should be organized, his return was very beneficial to the Bolshevik. They went on to organize. They went on to get a much popular support from workers. And he even had some ideological theories around how to engage the peasant of Russia at the time, because Russia at the time was the large population, particularly in the outskirts, not in the city, was a peasant population. Perhaps in one of the readings in future we must include that history. And so a lot happened between April and June. But in July, there's a protest organized in Petrograd by different constituencies, including socialist parties, socialist revolutionary parties that were there in Russia at the time. And then this protest happened in Petrograd, the capital city. But there was clashes between the White Army, they used to call it the White Army, the Russian army, which led to casualties and people died. Now, this happened in the absence of Lenin, because Lenin had taken a break to the outskirts of Petrograd to just get fresh air. And then this happened in his absence. And then he's not there when it happens. He comes back. On his way back, he learned that he was held responsible for the protest that happened in Petrograd, even in his absence. And there was a warrant of arrest issued by the Ministry of Interior to say that he must arrest Lenin. And he suspected that they were going to charge him with treason. And you are being arrested at a time where the country is not doing well in this world war. And then there is a lot of uncertainties around the elections. So if he had for his life and he decided, you know what, let me go to Finland and assess the situation and how it's going. So he goes to Finland, but he spent some time before he went to Finland. And this is where he gets to write the book, the book that we're going to look at, State and Revolution. And he had already started putting together material, like quotations and everything. But he wrote this book when he was in Finland for not a very long time. You know, some of us struggle with articles. It takes us very, very long. But Lenin wrote this book in a very short space of time. And in the book, he draws a lot from Marx and Engels. So that book has a lot of long quotations. If you look at the style of writing and how we write today, if that was an academic book today that he was writing, it wouldn't have been accepted by publishers. They will accuse him of a lot of plagiarism. But the intention of the book, when Lenin wrote it, was to just give a proper, genuine interpretation of what is Marxism theory of the state. Because if you look back at the 1901, he has always made an argument to say that there are opportunistic elements that are interpreting Marxism in a very conservative way, who think that we are going to achieve a proper socialist or socialism through gradual democratic processes. And he didn't believe in that. So he writes about the state, the Marx theory of the state, but also fundamentally what he does, he infused in the state and revolution a guide. It becomes a practical guide for those who are later on going to engage in a revolution, to say, this is how a revolution should be. Once you have completed the stage of a socialist revolution, this becomes the state. What do you do with the bourgeois state that was there? What becomes of the dictatorship of the working class? And then later on, how do you then grow into a proper communist society or communism? And he goes further to what Marx and Engels did, because he had much more experience with other revolutions which Marx and Engels did not have. So that's the nature of the book. And the book consists of 6 chapters. There was an intention to write it with a 7th chapter, which he never got to. And later on, he says that it was much more pleasurable to be in the revolution than write about it. That's Lenin. So let's get into the book now. Hopefully all of you have read it, because if you did not read, you will think some of the words that we're using are complicated words, but this is the text from the book. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to ask a broad question, and then I will try to answer it quickly. And hopefully by the time we've answered a couple of questions, concept, then we'll be able to have a complete picture of the Marxism theory of the state. So the first question is, what is the state? So throughout the history, there's always been class struggle. Marx concedes that he's not the one who came up with the concept of class struggle. So class struggle is when you have 2 classes in society that are in constant opposition to each other. That's a class struggle. So when you have a slave and the master, the class struggle there is that the master wants to control the slave also wants to be free. Then it becomes the struggle of the two. Now, in a modern society where the contradictions got sharper, so the class struggle that Lenin was referring to was a class struggle of capital and the workers. So I'm going to start using the word capitalism instead of bourgeoisie, and then I'm going to use the word working class instead of the proletariat. So the struggle has always been there in society. When the struggle happens, so this is what we call class struggle, the contradictions get sharper over time, meaning that the opposition between these 2 classes get sharpened with time. And so to speak, let's simplify it to say that the fight between 2 classes becomes to a boiling point where if there's no intervention, the society will in itself distract what it is. So the state then emerge in that class antagonism. Class antagonism, comrades like to use this word, but it's simply there's conflict between 2 classes. So the state emerge when these classes can't now reconcile their interest and their contradictions. The state emerges in the middle, and the way the state is positioned is that it's above classes. So in other words, it could be like a referee between this capitalist class and the state, and then capitalist class and the working class. So the state will emerge in the middle to moderate the contradiction and the antagonism between these 2 classes. That is where the state emerge. But through studying scientifically the history of the state, through Marxism, the Marx, Engels, and Lenin come to a conclusion to say it's all well and good for the state to emerge as a moderator, but what we have seen is that those who are economically dominant ultimately become dominant in the political space and therefore end up controlling the state. So the character of the state then becomes one where it becomes an organ of one class this class in the modern society being the capitalist class, and then it's used to oppress the exploited class, which is the working class. So that's how you characterize the state through Marxist. If you are a Marxist, through Marxism. So the state emerged to moderate, but eventually those who are economically dominant becomes also politically dominant, and then therefore turn the state into their instrument. And then we're going to talk to it in a second. So you can't reconcile the interest of the working class and the capitalist. The state emerged as a moderator, but eventually it becomes a tool. So how does the state work as an instrument of the capitalist class to oppress the working class? Now, Lenin writes about special bodies of armed men. So special bodies of armed men, it's your police, your military, standing military, and prisons. So in today's terms, how we understand the police is that if there's a robbery in my house, the first thing I do is to call the police. So I call the police, and then they come, and then we see police as a way to keep order in society. We see the military as a way to defend our borders, and should there be war, then they will go and defend us. But Lenin and Marx and Engels understood these bodies differently through Marxism. So they say that when the class that is economically dominant become politically dominant and turn the state into their instrument to oppress the working class, because throughout the history, the working class has been the majority compared to the capitalist class. So those ones have always been the minority. So if you look at the top richest people in the world, it's a very few minority group of people. It would be difficult for them to control a much larger group of students, young people, unemployed, religious groups, academics, intelligent people. So they create these bodies through the state and the notion of public power to be able to then control everyone else. And it's very easy to understand it. And I want to use an example, maybe it will be easier. So take Marikana, for example. So Marikana happened in 2012. The police killed mine workers in Marikana. Now, the background of that incident is that workers say that we're tired to work, we're being exploited, we want a minimum wage of no less than 12,500. And they are making these demands to a capitalist society, state, a capitalist-owned company. So when they make that demand, they protest. It's a prolonged strike. Workers have right to protest in South Africa. But in this instance, the strike takes longer than what usually most strikes would have taken in the history of South African strikes post-1994. And you see a conversation happening between the now President Cyril Ramaphosa with the Minister of Police then, who then spoke to the general in the police. And the outcome of those conversations is that the military massacre, the police massacre mine workers in Marikana. And they were not trying to keep a law and order in that instance. Essentially what they were doing there, they were defending the gains of capitalism so that they can continue to mine the platinum in Marikana. So these special bodies of armed men are created essentially to repress the working class, according to Marx, Engels, and Lenin. And they are there constantly in public. One day you might see a policeman helping an old person, it's an often liked example, to cross the road. But essentially, their purpose is not that. Those are supplementary activities which we see, but they are there to suppress the working class. So that is how the state is used as an instrument of a capitalist class in society. So the question then becomes, how do the working class that is being exploited and oppressed turn this around? So the book, the session last time spoke about how to move from a capitalist society to a socialist society, from capitalism to socialism. But there has to be a revolution, socialist revolution, a workers-led revolution. And this is not old. And those who argue that this was written in times of wars in the 1900s is not applicable today. That is what Lenin accused his comrades of, being conservative and interpreting Marxism not in a genuine way. So without a proper socialist-led revolution, what you are going to end up is some arrangement, and not to say those arrangements don't have gains. Those arrangements might have gains, like our arrangement in South Africa. We didn't have a socialist revolution in South Africa. We have now what is called freedom and democracy. So we're able to vote, we're able to move freely, and workers have more rights in their factories and everywhere else. But when you look at the essence of what South Africa is today, when you look at the level of unemployment, when you look at who own and control not only means of production, but essentially what the state does, you will realize that those gains are extremely limited, and over time, possibly whenever it happens, you will then be able to see a proper character of a socialism and socialist state, then moving on to communism. Because in any case, Marx and Engels argue that capitalism or a capitalist society is merely a development stage of society. So we have not always been a capitalist society. Capitalism and its system, in terms of the lifespan of society, is very limited. It's not very an old system. There's been other systems before. And Marx and Engels argue that this is just a phase moving towards a communist society, moving towards communism. So what will happen is that there's going to be a workers-led revolution in society, which will then usher in socialism and later on communism. But before that happens, workers have to get into the business of revolution, and by all means necessary, including war. And I mean, Lenin was accused of being obsessed with war, especially when he was still in his youthhood. One of the Menshevik leaders described Lenin as possibly at that time the only person who think about revolution all the time, including in his sleep. But the reality is that you can't imagine society, both scientifically and other way, when you look at material condition of today and historically, to be able to say, how do we get out of a capitalist society without a socialist-led revolution? So it's very difficult. So the working class have to lead society in its entirety and revolt against capitalism, by all means necessary. When they do that, they then be able to take over means of production, how we produce. That's what we're dealing with in the last session of the book club. So they take over means of production and then centralize this under the state control. Centralize strategic sectors of the economy under the state of control, centralize land, and then be able to dictate the terms of mode of production for the benefit of them as workers, but more so for society in general. So that is what must happen. There's no way out of it. Lenin and Marx and Engels argue. And I also agree with that argument, even if the argument was made so many years ago. That is the only way you can move society from its state now to socialism and eventually communism. And it can't happen in a spontaneous way. There has to be a revolution, there has to be an organization, there has to be class consciousness, so that it is led like it was the case in Russia in 1917. And that is why that was successful. So when workers lead this revolution, and hypothetically speaking, let's say, not hypothetically speaking, it will be successful when it happens. So workers lead the revolution, and then they're leading the revolution in a society where over and above the system, there's a state. That state, Lenin argued earlier on, the arguments are still being made today, it's a capitalist state. What do workers do with a capitalist state? So part of the book and what Lenin was trying to do was to do what he called a genuine interpretation of Marxism. So he says that, and this is not him, he doesn't claim any originality in that work of state and revolution. He says that looking at the history, looking at other revolutions and what Marx and Engels have did scientifically, when workers take over, they cannot take over the state, the capitalist state as it is, and the way it was designed to oppress them in the exploitation process, they have to smash, break, and destroy. I was listening to one YouTube video by a brilliant Marxist. He says it sounds much better in German. In English, it doesn't make sense. It sounds like tautology, but that's what it is. They have to take the bourgeois state, the capitalist state. They have to smash, break, and destroy. They cannot take the state the way it was designed for the suppression and exploitation of workers, and turn it into their own state. And the significance of that argument goes back to 1871, after the Paris Commune. So the Paris Commune happened, and it didn't last long. And Marx and Engels felt strongly that they must go back and amend the Communist Manifesto to say that we must include there a section which says that the workers cannot simply take over a capitalist ready-made state and turn it into their own tool. It's not possible. So you have to smash, break, and destroy a capitalist state. So when you smash, break, and destroy a capitalist state, then Lenin, Marx, and Engels argue that it is then that a state controlled by workers must emerge immediately. A state controlled by workers must emerge immediately, and this is a different state compared to the capitalist state. So you do away with a capitalist state and you have your own state. And in a way, the large section of the book try to point out the hypocrisy of what Lenin called opportunist tendencies that have emerged long before he wrote the book. Just that it has continued, and he used Katsky at the time as one of the people who he says that they are not interpreting Marxism correctly. You can't take a state that was designed by capitalism with the military budget it has, the police budget it has, because the anticipation by the minority capitalist is that when you have one group which is minority controlling majority and means of production, they need a much larger section of these armed men to be able to protect them. Whereas when you're looking at a socialist state where majority are in agreement that number one, we must nationalize means of production, number two, we must share the land, and we must be able to work and pay workers properly. You don't need the army. You don't need the expenditure that we spend on army and the police. You rather redirect that money towards somewhere else. And that is the argument around what you do with the capitalist state. You do away with it completely. And then you create out of it a working class state, what is called the dictatorship of the proletariat. So that is what happened. And then the other question that we must answer is that what happens to the state machinery now? So you have done away with the capitalist state. What happened to the machinery, the state machinery itself? So the state machinery we're referring to, for example, when you go to Home Affairs and apply for an ID, you do the application, there's paperwork, there are systems, there are staff, they get paid, there's procurement of things. So the bureaucracy, that's the word that is used, but essentially is what we commonly refer to as government. What do you do with it? Government and parliament. So what do you do with the bureaucracy? So Lenin, Marx and Engels argue that you can't speak of not having a state machinery simply because you have smashed, break, and destroyed the capitalist state. But equally, you can't have the capitalist state machinery because it won't serve the same purpose as the one you intend under a socialist, a state-led society. So the workers must do away also with the capitalist state machinery. They must have their own. And there's been other examples throughout revolution. We have the benefit of the 1917 revolution. There's the benefit of Cuba, for example. But also before that, there was the benefit of 1871, Paris Commune. So immediately when you destroy the capitalist state machinery, you must reorganize society. You must reorganize society in such a way that government is turned from being a political instrument to become a simple administrative function. There are no politics around putting up a street light. Whether you are a member of the EFF or a member of the ANC, at the end of the day, the street light needs to stand up and it needs to have light, essentially. So you need to turn administrative functions under a capitalist state, in a socialist state, turn them into simple functions. And then you reorganize society in such a way that people work, but people work not through exploitation, because no one will be able to exploit anyone, since means of production will be under the control and centralized under government. So the machinery that will exist will be a different state machinery altogether compared to the one that was existing before. And then, so what is the difference between anarchism and Marxism? Because and by the way, if you read the text, Lenin dedicated a whole chapter to the Paris Commune. That's how that experience was very important. So what is the difference between anarchist and Marxism? Anarchism and Marxism. Prohon and Bakunin, those who are reading proper historical literature. And it's there in the book. So the difference is that those who advocated for anarchism, they said that there has to be a socialist revolution, and we all agree on that. There's no disagreement. The Marxist, radical left Marxists agree on that. There has to be a socialist revolution led by workers. But they go a step further and say that when there is a socialist revolution, afterwards, there must not be anything. We must do away completely with the notion of the state, authority, subordination, and all forms of power. Those are the anarchists, and that's what they argue. And Marx, Engels, and Lenin says, no, that's not correct. You can't, because you still need in some way to have a state. Because you still need, in any case, to have schools. You still need to have hospitals, you need to pay work administration. If one of the things that comes out of the Communist Manifesto is that when you have centralized means of production, you must expand production rapidly, so that you produce for equal consumption by everyone, it means that you will need to have some form of capacity. But also, the other reason why you can't entirely do away with hierarchy in society. Take, for example, the example that Lenin used is and Lenin get the example from Engels, by the way, he writes in the book. So if you have a ship, a big ship, it needs to have command. There has to be a captain of the ship who gives command to the entire crew to say that, okay, from here, this is where we're going. You can't just, all of you now be at the front, leading this ship. So there has to be some order in some level, So that's the difference between anarchism and Marxism. And Lenin makes this very clear, So when people accuse the EFF of being anarchist, I think to myself, why? Because there's a much theoretical association of what anarchism is. Bakunin was just not being famous for nothing. There were people who were proud to be anarchists, and they didn't want any form of power, and that's not what the EFF stand for. So that is the difference between Marxism and anarchism. Now let's get to the last part of this, and in the last few minutes I'll just try and sum up the key concept of central argument in the book. Socialism. So now we have moved from capitalist-led state, from a capitalist society, capitalism. We are in the first stage, having completed a socialist revolution towards a communist society. Now that stage is called socialism, where we have a socialist state. Under socialism, we socialize means of production, meaning that production happens for the betterment of society, not purely for profit, as it is the case with the capitalist system. So we are going to produce, and there's not going to be any exploitation of any worker by anyone. We're going to produce a society, and Marx, Engels, and Lenin studied this through scientific experience of other revolutions to come to this conclusion. So when we're in this phase of socialism, the key inequality or the prejudice or the exploitation we're going to get out of immediately is the workers' exploitation, because workers themselves led the revolution. So there's not going to be any exploitation of workers. And then what happened is that we're going to socialize means of production. So in the Communist Manifesto, there are key points which immediately when you've completed a socialist revolution, you must then start implementing. Is this phase. Now, when you are in this phase, you still need a state. But this is the dictatorship of the working class. That is the state that exists. And the word dictatorship at the time when Lenin was writing, it's not associated with Idi Amin, for example. It simply means that we have transformed the working class now to become the ruling class and ruling over society as the majority, so the dictatorship of the working class. So the state will exist, but its form is different to the capitalist state. And then in this stage, we socialize means of production. We remove exploitation from society. You're still going to have other prejudices that exist in society. You might still find difficulties with issues of gender and gender discrimination and other forms of discrimination. But what won't be there is that people will be working under a socialist organized society. You work according to your ability. But in the first phase, transforming society from a socialist, from a capitalist system to a socialist system, you will still get what you work according to your ability. That is one of the inequality that Lenin pointed to. And this process then brings us to a stage where we talk about what is communism. Now, communism is the last phase, or what ideally is to be achieved. And it's not going to be achieved through utopia or imagination of some dreamland arrangement which we'll eventually get to. So there has to be a proper constant studying of material conditions in the revolution all the time, so that when you are in the revolution, you are able to say then, we are now in a socialist stage moving towards a communist society. And when you get to the communist level, communism, it's where, number one, Lenin says, you will work according to your ability. You will volunteer your work, but you will get back according to your need. In other words, you're not just going to get back according to your ability, although even today it's not true. You don't work according to your ability and get back according to your ability. Those who work the most under very difficult conditions, that they don't get what they deserve. People who are building a large construction site in the sun every day. Usually those who sit in the office were privileged by education, went to school, they earn a lot of money. So even today, it doesn't work that you get according to your ability. But under a communist society, you will get according to your needs, meaning that we are going to be producing in society, using our abilities where we can, because people don't have the same capacity as individuals, don't have the same abilities. But what you get eventually at the end of the day, it's what you need. So think of it this way, the nice example, the current situation. So the current situation, we're under lockdown. You don't just go out and eat at a restaurant, buy clothes. Sometimes you don't need those things. When you leave your house, the instructions, you go to the shop, you buy food. Even the food you buy, you'll notice that in the shelves, things that are moving are things that we need. Vegetables, starch, bread. So under communism, you're going to work according to your ability, but get according to your need. But also, one of the key concepts is that the state which existed, the state, the workers-led state, will then begin to disappear. It will wither away. That's the term that they use. Under communism, there won't be a state, because the last stage of this revolution is that we completely eliminate class struggle. So there's no class antagonism. Eventually, of course, when you take power from the capitalists, they will retaliate. One of the reasons why you leave the state is that you're able to suppress them. You're able to fight them, all means necessary. They will call it civil war, like they did with the 1917 Russian Revolution. But you have to protect the gains of revolution, because if you don't, you will win the revolution today immediately if you don't have a state standing ready to defend the revolution, the gains of the revolution. They are going to fight you back, and then they're going to take over power again. So that state won't be necessary under communism, because under communism, there won't be class contradictions, there won't be class struggle, there won't be antagonistic tendencies amongst people. We will then be able to live without the need for a state. And then the state will wither away. That's the word that they use. And Lenin shows there that the word withering is very deliberate. The first time I encountered the word, I couldn't even pronounce it. So the word withering means that you disappear, but you disappear gradually. It happens slowly. It's not instant like magic, and one day you wake up, there's no state led by workers. So it will happen over time. It will happen over time, and it will happen in such a way that it will happen gradually, but also in a spontaneous way. So you won't sit and wait and say, I want to see how this state is going to disappear under communism. It's not going to happen like that. It's going to wither away eventually. And then we'll all live happily without having to antagonize each other. Also, the key thing of the book, which it's very uncomfortable to speak of today, but it's a correct interpretation of Marxism, is that what happens to democracy under communism, and to understand democracy under Lenin writing, Marx and Engels' analysis and studying of society, one has to understand that democracy is also a state. You know, democracy doesn't exist in itself. It's a state. And democracy is not the same as freedom. And I hope that one day when we do the readings, we might start including this bourgeois literature just to show that there's a difference between freedom and democracy. So democracy will happen under a socialist state, but eventually when the state wither away, democracy will also wither away with it. We won't need democracy because Marx, Engels, and Lenin says that we would have learned to live together and be able to observe each other human values, respect each other. You won't need a constitution to tell you that you have a right to live, you have a right to education, you have a right to health. That is a state in itself. You will know that you are born under a communist society. This is communism. You are going to go to school. You will have to be educated, because if we are going to control means of production as workers, you will then have to know how to operate machines. Today you will need to know how to code. You will need to understand how to use computers. You need to be very literate to be in the revolution. You can't be in the revolution and not be reading. And we're not saying go to school and do PhD, but you need to engage in scientific understanding of your society and where the society is going. So that is Lenin, but to correctly say it, it's Marx, Engels, and Lenin, State and Revolution. And that is the last question, which hopefully, having answered those key questions, then I'll deal with it. But there are questions that were submitted, and quickly, I'm just going to go through them. The first question that was submitted, unfortunately, there was no name for this question. It's, what kind of state is South Africa today? So, last week, Dr. Komisambo said that South Africa today is a capitalist neo-colonial state, right? And he explained that the existence of the South African state today, in all its form, in all its character, parliament, by the nature of the laws that are being passed in parliament, if you look at, for example, the president and the government, like departments, it's a state that exists entirely to protect the interest of those who control means of production, the companies, your businesses, big businesses, banks, and individuals who control those businesses, because those businesses don't control themselves. As much as they are listed in the JSE, there are big figures behind them. You have your Anton Rupert, your Johann Rupert, you have your Oppenheimers, the family, and historically it goes. So the state exists so that they are able to continue to exploit the working class and society material in its totality for their own benefit, and their own benefit, it's purely to just make more profit. So last year, someone else got 11 billion more to their wealth, and this year they're going to report another billion more. That's how they keep the state in its existence. But the neo-colonial aspect of the South African state is that after decolonization of the state, and generally politics, not entirely economics, South African existence, or the state in its totality, it protects the interest of accumulation. And there's a clear link between the imperial existence of Britain, Europe, and the West. So they don't just protect so that Anton Rupert and Johann Rupert and the Oppenheimers can make money. They make that money, but there's a strong relationship between accumulation or making profit in today's date and benefit the former colonizers without them being present here and colonize us. So you don't have chains anymore. There's no law that restricts you to participate actively in politics. So you exist, but they use the state to then continue to make profit. Now, the other question that was sent, there's a fighter who sent a question here. I'm just quickly going to read it. It's a very key question about China. Essentially, has been been a communist state for a very long time, and the fighter here is asking, why is the Chinese state not withering away? That's the question that he asks. So I can't clearly see his names here. So essentially, his question is, why is the state not withering away after having been there in a long time? So when I was concluding Lenin's text, he says that it won't happen instantly, but also they don't put time frame in terms of when the state is going to then eventually disappear. They argue that it's going to happen gradually. In other words, it's going to be a process that with its spontaneity, one day you'll wake up and then we'll realize that we actually don't need a state, and then we'll do away with it. So China, you can't say China is fully developed now, all its problems are solved, but also China doesn't exist in isolation. China exists in the global capitalist society. So to fold your arms now and sit back and relax and disarm yourself as a communist state of China, you're going to have serious problems. You're going to have major problems, and the war in today's day and age is not fought the way in which it was fought back in the days, where you have warships that comes in your waters and then there are bombs and everything. You're going to have an immediate technology warfare between America and China. If China doesn't defend its gains of revolution, it still needs the state. So you have to have the state. Someone else asked, so Limkis asked the question in the first reading, and then also when DP was doing the founding manifesto, he's reading. So he asked a question, the difference between the bourgeois state and socialist state and the preventative measures from elevation of state from society. It's also Solu asked about the China, and essentially I explained it that the bourgeois state is the one that looks after the interest of the capitalist system and capitalism in general. The socialist state, on the other hand, after you smash, break, and destroy the capitalist state, you then have to have a socialist workers-led state, so that you're able to protect the gains of the revolution, but equally you are able to then move forward in terms of productive society, build schools and everything else. There's also a question here by fighter Samuel Mamtoteng from Johannesburg, Ward 32. He asked, Lenin seems to rule out private ownership of homes in a worker state. Has such ownership been eliminated in present worker states such as Russia and Cuba? That's a key question, because in the book there's a chapter there, not a chapter, it's a section, I think under chapter 3, where they talks about the housing question. So Lenin doesn't rule out, he's very cautious the way he approached the housing question. So from the outset, he immediately stated that we are using the housing question to illustrate, based on the Paris Commune experience, but also generally to illustrate that the Marxism theory of the state, it will work in certain ways, and the housing question is being used as an example. So in the Paris Commune, when they took over, they expropriated all properties from the landlords, because at the time the landlords were part of the bourgeoisie system. But if you take and historically, there's been a lot of things that happen. You can't apply scientifically the same conclusion that was applied, or the same struggle mechanism that was applied in Paris Commune, other revolutions that took place. But because what happened now today, for example, let's take the question of land. So as the EFF, we're saying that it's going to happen, land expropriation without compensation. But there are workers today who own houses. So you can't then go and collectivize houses that are owned by workers. The question was posed in an environment where workers were not owning their own homes, but they were either renting, and when they were renting those houses, they were paying very inflated prices. So you then find that Lenin cautiously then proceeds to reference Engels, and he says, even under a socialist state, you will need to pay some form of rent, right? Because you are in a productive society. It's eventually when you reach a communism, a communist society where you won't need, for example, those houses that are owned by the state. You won't need to collect rent there. But in today's day, the material conditions have changed hectically. You have to study society with its constant changes, and you have to be grounded in materialism to be able to understand where society is going. So that is a few questions that came in. There are other questions. Let's continue to engage on Twitter and Facebook, but also let's read fighters. There are no shortcuts around this, otherwise you're going to come sit here and complain that we're using big words, but these words are on the text itself. And when we're reading, let's reach out to each other, try and clarify some of the things that are confusing us, and not go out and tell people that we're going to collectivize workers' houses. Workers are going to continue to keep their houses. So we're going to now, for the next 3 days, read also Fanon. We're moving on to Fanon now. We're going to read Fanon. We're going to read Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. And then we'll announce who's going to lead that discussion. But also we're going to post the link to that text, that literature, on our Facebook account. We're going to post it on the Twitter also. But also use the WhatsApp number to request the readings, and email also. The WhatsApp number that we are using, also to send questions. When you don't wait for the day when we're doing the session to send questions. You must send questions as you're reading. So the WhatsApp number that we are going to use, we're using, let me just quickly find it. 0844440 08444408948. That's the number. 08444408948. Send questions on our communications at affonline.org. Email will take also, but send videos also, fighters, and then we'll engage. So let's go. Lockdown. We stay at home. We're still on lockdown now. I think it's day 9. Wash our hands frequently for no less than 20 seconds with soap. When we go to the shops, fighters, we go one at a time. You don't have to take the whole family unless you have no options, but you must take your kids to the shop, but it's really not safe. And also, fighters, when we go to the shops, let's observe social distancing. I see shops are trying to put stickers there so that when you stand, you're not too close to each other. Otherwise, next, The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. Thank you very much, fighters, for tuning in and engaging. Let's continue the discussion and let's go into the next reading. Otherwise, thank you very much. Salute.